Hey folks, Sam here from Canva. I'm going to be taking the design, the UI UX lectures for COMP6080. I'm sure a lot of you guys sitting in this room come from a more technical background. This is a computer science course after all. So one thing that I definitely struggled with, also coming from a technical background, as I started to build front ends and applications and websites, was getting my UI designs looking right. I could make a website, I could write all the code, I could get all the data, but one thing I couldn't do was make an app that looked professional. And I think UI fundamentals, really nailing the UI fundamentals, is one thing you can do to help your apps feel more professional, feel more right, and just get a bit more polish in your end result. So hopefully today you guys will all learn something that you can apply, one tip, one trick to make your apps feel like the real deal. So before we get into some UI fundamentals and some tricks, I want to very quickly walk through what is the difference between UX and UI as for what the scope we're going to cover today is. So UX stands for user experience, whereas UI stands for user interface design. So user experience is a bit bigger picture. It's thinking broadly around the usability of the app. Who are the users using the app? What processes are they trying to undertake? And does the app feel logical? Does it help them achieve those processes? User experience designers often also take on the role of doing user research, interviewing users to find out about their processes, or running low fidelity sketches past users to make sure the process makes sense. So if user experience design is looking at the process and the bigger picture, which is very important, but not what we're going to be focusing on today, user interface design is the flip side of that. It's looking at the individual states and screens of an app. So it's breaking down the process, looking at what does the button look like? What copy are we going to use here? What graphic are we going to use here? How are things going to be aligned? It's kind of the branding of the app. It is the visual design. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at that visual design side of things. In making this talk, I had to ask myself, what was the aim of doing visual design for an application? And I think what I arrived at was that we do visual design for apps and websites to make it easier to use. It's kind of three core ideas in there. One is we want to make sure people aren't scared. There's a lot of things in visual design that are innately related to the human brain and how humans perceive things. So making things feel aligned, feel well-colored, harmonious is important so that people can take your app seriously. They don't flinch, they don't look away. They're not like, oh no, I can't use this because it looks terrible. That's important. We're going to look at that first. The second thing we're going to look at is kind of based on how people use apps. So different apps have different modes of interaction. A really common mode of interaction for front ends, especially that we're building in the web or for apps, is scanning. So where people search to find something on the page and then they do something with it. So that's going to be the last two sections of this lecture where we look at how we can make it easier for users to find things through visual hierarchy, and then how we can make it easier for users to do something with what they found. And that's going to be affordances. So yeah, that's an outline for what we're doing today. On to our first section today of how we ensure users aren't scared of your application by following some graphic design basics. So there's three basics I want to walk through today. I really love threes. And the three basics we're going to be looking at today is alignment, which ironically, the heading there is looking very misaligned, if I say so myself, fonts and colors. So alignment is the way humans love consistent patterns. They love things to be aligned, equally spaced, symmetrical. So we're going to look at how we can use a grid to help create great alignment within an application. Because obviously the challenge there is that in your application, you have lots of different types of things, lots of different buttons, lots of content, and how you can make that all feel aligned, even though it is inherently different. With fonts, we're going to look, obviously, when you're making a website, you need to pick fonts for your website or your application. So we're going to kind of break down how we can approach that. And ditto for colors. Very easy to pick a single color, but often the question is, my website needs more than one color because there's multiple elements in my website. So we're going to look at how we can use maths, because a lot of programmers in this room, I assume. So I'm sure we all love maths. We're going to use how we can use maths to get colors that look great together. Sweet. On to our first kind of part of this section, which is alignment. I want to take a step back and think just broadly, what does alignment mean? I think it's something very innately human, right? When I was doing this talk, I have this second motive, which is I want to convince you guys that there is some logic to these rules that designers have created. And I think for me, I realized that was because so much of this is hardwired in our brains. as humans. If you look at the image on the left, it's of a house with lots of wavy lines, very crooked. I think that's something we would associate as being spooky. On the other hand, the skyscrapers on the right, clean lines, very aligned looking, each of the buildings. So that's much more trustworthy looking than the house on the left. So what I wanted to draw from that was that there is some intuition behind why we strive for alignment in our UI and why we more generally strive for consistency as we're going to be doing all throughout this talk. So it's not just me making up rules. For a lot of these things, there is that kind of human nature that drives us to want to do these things. To create alignment in visual design, often we use grids. This is a concept that's gone back centuries. I found this picture of a book. I don't know where this book is from, but it looks pretty old because it's in black and white. That's how you know it's old. But as we can see here, the way the text is laid out on the page of the book is no accident. The designers created these columns. Often when we talk about grids in design, we're actually only talking about columns, but that's another story. So they created these columns and then they've matched up the text to these equally spaced columns, and that creates a sense of consistency throughout this design. So a grid is made up of columns and gutters, as we can see. I'm going to switch to a slightly better example with a bit more modern example with the BBC website. Everyone's seen it, right? It's a news website. It lists news in different ways, different sizes, all fancy things. If we look at a grid here, if we overlay, so we've got the BBC website, I'm going to overlay this grid on the BBC website. We can see that what I've done with this grid is I've put 12 columns, and each of them have a 16 pixel gap between each column, and we call that the gutter. As you can see, kind of like magically, the 12 columns line up with all of the things on the page. Even at the top where we have, at the bottom where we have 3 items per row, and at the top where we have this kind of complicated, like 1 big item and then 2 small items, we see the grid lines them up perfectly. And that is what makes this user interface look visually pleasing to look at, because it is so consistent. We often use 12 columns for a grid because it can be commonly divided into so many useful numbers. Here we see it's divided into 3. We see it's divided into 2 for the large news story on the top left. We see it can be divided into 4 across for the little news stories on top right, and it can also be divided into 6 across. That's basic maths right there. And then we have the gutter between them. What we do in the BBC, if I'm just going to zoom in for a second, we can see that we've aligned we've taken the content and we make sure to align it to the edge of the column. So I put a blue circle here. We see the content goes all the way to the edge of the column, but not over the margins. So we use the margins to create consistent spacing between items. This, using grids, is another thing, that we notice if we just go back, is we see that the grid doesn't take up the entire width of the page. One thing that's quite important when you're making a website, especially a text-heavy website like a news site, is readability. It's quite hard to read text that goes the entire width of a computer monitor, especially as they get larger and larger. So we see here in the BBC, they put a 1200 pixel limit, and outside of 1200 pixel, there's just paddings, or like if there was like an image section, for instance, the image might spill over or the color might spill over, but all the text, all the content, all the things you're reading, that's never wider than 1200 pixels. And that's how we create these grids responsively in a digital context, rather than just on pen and paper. Wait, so I want to walk through another small example, because I think grids are one of the magic panaceas for making a design look better. On the left, I've sketched out a basic landing page, right? This is something you can do quite easily. Just sketch it on paper, or in this case, I've used an app called Figma to sketch it out. Then on the right, I add a grid and I drag all the stuff so that it's now aligned to the grid. And it looks, chef kiss, perfect, I think. If I take away the grid, you're just comparing them. I think if you were to zoom in, you'd probably feel like the right-hand side looks a bit more professional. And that's all you have to do that is, choose a grid, choose some numbers, using 12 columns, very common number. Choose a maximum width for your page, 1200 pixels, another very common number, and just start lining things up. There is one thing to note here is grid we're using grid as a design term here. You might think, we do have a technology called CSS grid. You don't necessarily need to be using that to achieve this. This is all just about the widths of items. So just using the grid when you're drawing things out to calculate how wide items should be. That's how you can implement this in your websites. Sweet. Now from grids onto typography or fonts. So generally with fonts, one tip that I'd love to give is less is more. We obviously want consistency in the design. We don't want users to be guessing, what font means something is more important than another thing. And so limiting the number of font options, font sizes, different text stylings that we have is a great way to create that consistency and make a design easier to understand. In particular, I would strongly recommend sticking if you have one website, stick to one or two font families. I was really surprised actually. I do a lot of work with graphic designers, and one thing we found, especially with print designs and posters, because I work at a company called Canva, we found that high 90% of those, when they're designed by professionals, only have one or two fonts in an entire design. So it's very rare that you would want to add more fonts than that. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And you can do this, you can plan for this ahead of time. So in particular, you could create a font palette to create that consistency. So you know which is the heading font and how big heading should be, so that you don't create lots and lots of different font styles. On the left is a very simple font palette. You can just Google font pairing or font combination on the internet, and you'll find lots of examples of these. So this is just having a title, subtitle, and body text. On the right is actually a very real-world example from Google's material design library. In that case, it's actually only one typeface. It's the Roboto font, but we have different variations of bold and light and medium. But even here, we have 10, 15 sizes, and that's for the entirety of Google's material products. So really keeping an eye out for minimizing the number of different fonts you use is something that most websites do, and something that you can do to make your website feel more professional, just by creating a table like Google's done here, using free online tools such as the material guidelines to create that table with your own fonts, or finding another one on the internet. That can be a great way to achieve very consistent type, and that sense of consistency that makes your user interface look more professional. Now on to probably my favorite one of these three, which is colors. So I want to start with a bit of a motivating example. One thing you'll notice in apps is we often have very simple color palettes. Here's an example, again, from Google's great material design guidelines, but this is of just a simple demo analytics application. Here, the whole app palette of this app, obviously this is only one screen, but you would keep this consistent across all screens in the app, which is having, for example, a primary hue, maybe a secondary hue. In this case, I've included a secondary hue, and then just using black, white, and various grayscales throughout your UI. Obviously, as part of this, it's very important to pick colors that work nicely together. And that is an art in and of itself. If you're particularly design-minded, that's probably something you can eyeball and just pick out colors. But I'm not particularly design-minded, so I'm going to walk through how I would go about. If I decided my brand color was purple or my brand color was blue, how I would go about making a lighter version and a darker version, so that I've got a bit more contrast. I've got a couple more variations to play with throughout the app, so that I have this kind of wide palette, so that I don't have to go and choose random colors later down the line. Sweet. So I've got two example palettes here, right? Palette on the left, palette on the right. I think the palette on the left looks much more harmonious. The palette on the right looks a bit more scattered. The colors don't particularly match. In this case, the aim I was going for was having the same hue. So hue is a color term, and it kind of means the color of the color. So hue is usually used in conjunction with terms like luminance or saturation. In that case, luminance would be describing how bright a color is, or how saturation is a similar thing. So hue would be describing what actual color it is, whether it's blue, red, and so on. Anyway, so my aim here was to create palettes with different hues, with a consistent hue to make them really harmonious. And I think I did that on the left. On the right-hand side, though, not very successful. Why is that? So as coders, we often look at colors through hex codes. Hex codes are just a hexadecimal encoding of RGB values. So that's red, green, and blue. And if we look at the RGB values here, they're actually kind of useless. RGB is a terrible color space for a lot of what we're doing. RGB is RGB is how displays talk about colors. It's how they light up the pixels to create the colors. However, it doesn't encode a lot of useful information. In particular, it's not at all linear. A RGB 50-50-50 is not half as bright as RGB 100-100-100. And also it doesn't embody the ideas that we want around like colors having hue and saturation. So RGB is often the wrong way to look at colors when you're trying to design things, even though it's what you need to do when you're actually coding the app. So we can use different color spaces here. Examples of different color spaces are things like LAB or lab, HSL, and HSB. These color spaces aim to be more, so lab in particular is really interesting. It aims to be perceptually uniform. So fixing that issue where, so like double of a color should look doubly bright, for instance. That is really interesting. But all of these seek to encode more useful information so we can actually understand the colors and do maths on them. These are all things, you can look up the formulas online, or you can use like online calculator tools to convert between them. There's like maths that they use to convert between RGB and these other color spaces. In this case, I use the HSL color space. So that stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue is measured from 0 to 360 degrees. It's like what hue it is, from going from red to blue, so on. Saturation and lightness then measure the intensity and the whiteness of the color. So in this case, what we can see when we convert all these colors to HSL, is that the harmonious palette on the left has a consistent hue for all of the colors, whereas the less harmonious palette on the right is using has subtle variations in hue for all the colors. So if you're not a designer like me, then I would recommend thinking of color through this mathematical lens to try to allow you to pick colors more effectively, to create the harmony. For instance, when choosing a hue and a central brand color, and then dragging the only changing saturation and luminance to create some variation, so you can have darker and lighter versions for use around your application. If you're really interested in colors, I don't know if I've done the best job of selling how exciting and thrilling this is of a science, but there's a really good conference talk. It's about 20 minutes. I've linked to it in the slides here that walks through a brief history of how we've arrived and what color spaces you might want to use, other than just using HSL because it's quite useful. So if you don't want to listen to a long conference talk, I would recommend some great free online tools such as Colorizer. Peloton's a terrific one. It gives you this hue wheel, and you can very easily add multiple points with various saturation and lightness points in the middle to create those harmonious color palettes. Or Adobe Color does a very similar thing, and they're also all free. So if I give any recommendation about colors, it would be that just like if you want colors that look harmonious, they should have nice mathematical relationships. And using tools like this will help you get colors with nice mathematical relationships so they do look visually pleasing. And obviously consistency is key. Just like with fonts, we don't want to have lots of fonts. We also don't want to have lots of colors. So choosing some core brand colors, such as just choosing one brand color and perhaps a secondary color, that's a great way to make an app that looks really consistent. Now we're on to part 2, which is affordances. So I wanted to bring up a motivation for affordances, and I thought a great example of that is something that is really complicated but really simple at the same time, and that is an electricity bill. Who doesn't love electricity bills? Yeah, you get them, you pay them. Oh, they're terrible. So electricity bills have a lot of information. There's information about how much electricity you've used, who you can contact if there's no electricity, who you can contact if you want to dispute the bill, when the bill is due, all the ways to pay the bill. Because electricity bills, lots of people get electricity bills. Some people may have never paid an electricity bill before. Some people might need information about assistance programs to help them pay their bill. There's so many stakeholders involved with an electricity bill, so many needs, so many features. If we're thinking as as our developers, there's a lot of features of an electricity bill. So the real design challenge for an electricity bill is how can we make most people happy? And the way we do that is we create visual hierarchy. So what is visual hierarchy? Visual means visual. We're talking about graphic design. Hierarchy means hierarchy means hierarchy. So it's about having the most important things at the top and prioritizing them, and then understanding what's the least important. So, for instance, in an electricity bill, things that are probably really important is knowing what bill it is, if it's your electricity bill or your gas bill. That's very important to know. Second thing is knowing how much is due and when you need to pay it by. And then probably also and then as we go down the list, things get less important. So that's things like, how much electricity do I use in case I'm interested in reducing that? Or who can I contact if I have a problem with the bill? Obviously, hierarchy comes from a bit of a user experience understanding of like what is important to our customers, what is important about our product. But visual hierarchy is then how we translate that into our design. So great example with the electricity bill is, as we said before, probably the most important thing in the electricity bill is knowing how much you've got to pay and when you've got to pay it. As we can see, that information is in a bright blue box in big bold text. So it's quite obvious from seeing the electricity bill how much you need to pay. And you can see that even before you've seen everything else. So great design here is saving the users of your electricity bill time, because they don't have to read the whole bill to get the information they need to know. So how do we create this? All right, I just mentioned that we have this big text, so that's kind of like size, in a big blue box, so that's color and contrast. But I want to break that down into 6 elements so that you can think of what techniques can I use to make sure that the important information in my application is made prominent. So elements of visual hierarchy. Size, that's pretty obvious. Bigger is more important. Ditto with color, the brighter, so having the bright blue instead of a grayscale color, again, makes it seem more important. Contrast is another interesting one. Actually, we'll flip back to the electricity bill. Notice how the charge here, the total due, is inside a white box, which is inside a blue box. So that contrast between the white and the blue adds even further prominence to that visual element, because our eyes are drawn to the contrasting colors. So on top of color, you can use contrasting colors to draw further attention. Spacing is another big one, and actually it is used in the electricity bill here. What a terrific electricity bill, because we put the total due in a box, and we haven't made it this tiny box. We've given it some nice padding around the box. And again, just like a mountain that's in the middle of a flat area is going to look like a taller mountain than a mountain that's next to a bunch of other mountains. Having this big bold text in the middle of a white box that provides lots of padding gives it that extra prominence that again draws more attention to it. Alignment's another important thing. So if I were to align lots of things in a row, snap them to the same grid, for instance, they would look less important. Whereas if I had one thing that was out of order, the one thing that's outside would look more important. And repetition, again, building on that same idea. So one thing you'll notice with visual hierarchy is all of these things are relative. And that's actually quite hard, especially in industry, right? Because visual hierarchy isn't about what's important. Obviously, everything in your app is important, because otherwise you wouldn't have put it in your application. But some things are more important than others. So you've got to have the product kind of knack there to be able to know what's not important and what you're going to hide, because only a subset of users might use it. So in the electricity bill, for instance, we put in the useful information about budgeting. We've put in that they put that at the bottom in this smaller text, and that's probably based on an assumption that that a lot of people who are getting electricity bill are just going to be able to pay it, and less people are going to need that information again. So that is an example of visual hierarchy in action. Obviously, we're not a course that's making electricity bills. We are, of course, making websites and front ends. So I did want to walk through a second example just to highlight some of these techniques, because I think it's very important to understand them and be able to apply them to your own designs. ABC News. News is a classic example of visual hierarchy, because as well as visual hierarchy happening, which is using graphic design to communicate what's most important, hierarchy is actually the idea of prioritizing things and having one element more important than another is so inherent to a news website, because obviously there's so much news happening in the world, and ABC has had to decide this is the top story that we're going to put on our website. So there's a lot of prioritization happening within this page, and I think that's really interesting. The first thing to notice is what's made unimportant. In this case, I think it's the header navigation bar. Probably not something you need to draw users' attention to, because most people will expect there to be a navigation bar. So they've made it darker so that you can't really, so that it's less, it draws less attention. There's a lot of repetition happening. Everything is neatly aligned. So it makes it very easy to ignore the header, which again, that's saving our users time because most of our users are going to be aiming for the news stories that interest them. They don't want to have to, we don't want to burden them with having to like look at and understand the header in order to use our website. This was taken a couple days ago. I don't know when you guys are going to be seeing this lecture, but this was back when there was the big Facebook changes. So we got a big banner here about Facebook. And again, we're using spacing. There's so much shit ton of padding in this banner. Really draws your attention. We're using contrast here. The blue really contrasts against the white. The blue color is also super bright. So that's probably like the thing that's really grabbing most people's attention when they view this page. Again, obviously in the actual headlines here, we're using size to indicate importance. The biggest headline is in the top left. It's using a bigger font than the headlines below it. And that again is also using a bigger font than the just in section and a bigger font than the features section. So we're using size to communicate which stories the ABC thinks is most important for its readers. Another more subtle one is between the features and just in, because even though they are very similar in size, we have very different usage of color here. The features section uses a lot of color, again, really drawing out our users' eyes to for instance, the COVID vaccine story, whereas the just in section is completely devoid of color. So it's very easy to pass over when you first look at the ABC website. So that is kind of what hierarchy is about. It's about knowing what's important. In this case, the editors made the decision that the top story should be around the alleged assault in the PM's office. So then designing, and of course the Facebook news thingo. So then designing a website and using these visual tricks to make that the first thing that users see can help save the users time. On to part 3. All right, we've made our users not be scared of the app because we aligned things, we chose good fonts and good colors. We then use visual hierarchy, so they're able to find what they wanted really quickly. Now, how can we help them use the app to actually do something with what they've found? The answer is affordances. What is an affordance? An affordance is a visual property of an element that lets users know they can do something with it. For example, classic example of an affordance. Affordance is broader than just UI design on a screen. So classic example is a handle on a door. If you just saw a wall there, you probably wouldn't know that you could open it. But because there's a handle on a door, it lets you open it easily because you can grab the handle, but it also is a visual language that lets you know that it is a door rather than just being a wall. And obviously, I suppose an equivalent of that is a button on a web page. But affordances are really important because otherwise people can't use your apps to actually do anything. So let's look at some types of affordances because I think this helps you think about, all right, when I have an action in my app, what type of affordance have I used for it? And is that the appropriate type? Do I need to make it more explicit? So this is only a subset of the types of affordances, but I think they're like the important types. First one, I think, is explicit affordances. The explicit affordances tell users how to interact with something. Classic example of that is a click here link. It's like click here to sign up. And you click the link. It's literally telling users what to do. Slide to unlock. Another example of a pattern affordance. Of an explicit affordance. It's telling the user to slide. There's also a bit of a skeuomorphic affordance happening here. So skeuomorphism is a style of design that takes physical objects and tries to make them do the same thing on a computer. So we've got this kind of like, we've got all the shadows, so it looks like it could actually physically move if it was a real thing. So again, that's all telling the user what they can do with this element on the screen. Obviously, these days, we're not really into skeuomorphic, so another example of an explicit affordance would be a button. I've chucked in the sign-up buttons on Canva. So again, we're using color. We're using rounded corners because that kind of signals that it's a button. We've got some background color. A lot of the time, we would also have shadow, and that signals that you can interact with it. Obviously, a problem with explicit affordances is they take up a lot of space. And as we learned from visual hierarchy, if our action isn't very important, it shouldn't take up a lot of space because that would waste our users' time. They would think it's more important than it really is. So we can often use things like pattern affordances for these kind of secondary actions. Pattern affordances allude to a common pattern that users might be familiar with from other applications to imply that an interaction is possible. Really common patterns would be things like underlined blue text, implying that something is a link, or that hamburger or the 3 dots icon, implying that something is a menu. Nothing about those like 3 dots or the hamburger there tells users like this is a menu. It's not written menu, but it's just a pattern that a lot of users are familiar with because it is so common. Another example would be a checkbox. a checkbox, especially in the unchecked state, doesn't say, check me, but a lot of people have seen what a checkbox looks like, so they know what to do with it. Pattern affordances are a bit tricky, though. It's really important that you make sure you are using patterns that are familiar to your users. Don't use, especially if you're making like a small application, if you were working at Microsoft or Google or one of the OS manufacturers, you might be able to start to try and create new patterns. But for a lot of us who will just be making apps or websites, we want to stick to patterns that are really familiar for our users. So you got to have that understanding of users when using pattern affordances. The third type of affordance, and this is actually quite an important one, is false affordances. I don't have too many examples because usually people don't ship things that use false affordances. And a false affordance is where something looks like it could do something, but it actually can't. So that would be creating something that looks like a button, but actually isn't a button. Or that it looks like a hamburger menu, but it's not actually a hamburger menu. So false affordances are just something you need to be aware of when you are creating elements in the UI. It's often useful to have someone else go through UI and see, just asking them, was there anything that they thought they could click on or that they thought they could interact with, but actually they couldn't? And then considering alternative designs for that element so that it doesn't create the false affordance. So that was UI fundamentals. I hope you guys all learned something, at least one little tip or trick that you can use to make your UIs look a bit more professional. In review, I think we looked at alignment to make your design look less scary, a grid as being a really easy way to create alignment and very popular for websites and apps. Second was we then looked at creating a font or color palette beforehand to create consistency, and you often want to make that quite small so that the app feels consistent and feels very familiar to users as they use it. We looked at how we could use maths to choose harmonious colors, and then we looked at after you've set up these great foundations with the alignment, the fonts, and the colors, using visual hierarchy to communicate what is most important. So if you're working in a team or working alone, just having that decision made of what you think the most important thing for your app users is, and making sure that is the first thing that people's eyes are drawn to, so they don't have to waste time searching through your entire app to find the most important feature. And then when they found it, making sure that we're using the right type of affordances so they do understand they can interact with it. That's all for this lecture. See you guys next time.